Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material.
Glad to be here.
So imagine you've dedicated your entire life to a single institution.
Right.
You sacrifice your weekends, your health, maybe even the best years of your family life, all under this promise that the system would protect you.
That it would honor your loyalty, yeah.
Exactly. And now imagine that very same institution not only coldly discards you, but actively uses the fruits of your own labor to destroy everything you have left.
Oh, man, it's a nightmare.
It really is. What happens to a human mind when the social contract is completely, just irreversibly shattered?
That's the big question.
Right. So today, our mission is to extract profound, practical life lessons from a piece of source material that takes that exact scenario to its most terrifying, blood-soaked extreme.
Yeah, we're talking about William Shakespeare's early Roman tragedy, Titus Andronicus.
Now, I know what you're thinking. A 16th century play about a fictional Roman general who ends up baking people into pies.
Right. It doesn't exactly sound like a standard self-help manual.
No, not at all. But we aren't here just to recap a tragedy. We're using this text with all its blood and chaos as a mirror for modern conflicts.
Yeah, because we're looking at overwhelming grief and the totally destructive nature of unchecked retaliation.
That is the core of what we're doing today in this deep dive.
Because look, while you listening might not be fending off rival empires or, dodging sword fights on your morning commute.
I certainly hope not.
Right, but you absolutely navigate broken systems. You deal with interpersonal betrayals that feel completely world-ending.
Oh, absolutely. We all face that temptation to hold on to toxic grudges, to secretly wish that someone who hurt us would just suffer just as much in return.
That impulse is a fundamental part of the human condition. And Titus Andronicus is one of the few pieces of literature that forces us to look at the absolute bottom of that impulse.
It really doesn't let you look away.
No, it doesn't. We're going to trace this horrifying cycle of vengeance, starting from a single, seemingly justifiable decision.
And we'll watch how it unravels a whole society.
Along the way, we're also going to look at this fascinating historical debate about whether Shakespeare actually even wrote this play.
Yeah, because the sheer ugliness of the text has divided scholars for centuries.
It really has.
So to understand the absolute wreckage of these characters' lives, we have to start at the very beginning of the cycle of violence.
The seed of vengeance.
Right. And what becomes immediately clear in the opening moments of the play is that the root of all this destruction isn't some chaotic, mustache-twirling villainy.
No, it's rigidity. It's the complete and total failure of empathy disguised as duty.
So we begin in Act 1. Set the visual stage for us here.
Okay, so the setting is crucial. Titus Andronicus, this aging, noble Roman general, is returning to Rome as a conquering hero.
Right.
He's just spent 10 ruling years fighting a brutal war against the Goths.
But this victory is like a massive Pyrrhic victory, right?
Oh, the cost has been staggering.
Yeah.
Of his 25 sons, 21 have been killed in battle.
Wait, 21 sons? That's just an unfathomable level of grief.
Right. So he returns to the city not just with spoils of war, but with the coffins of his own children. He's preparing to bury them in the ancestral tomb.
Heavy. Very heavy atmosphere.
Exactly. And he also brings back prisoners of war. Tamora, the queen of the Goths, along with her sons, and her secret lover, Aaron the Moor.
So we have this protagonist who is just drowning in grief. He's given almost his entire bloodline to the state of Rome.
And right in the midst of this heavy, funereal atmosphere, Titus's surviving son, Lucius, steps forward.
And he makes this procedural demand that sets the entire nightmare into motion.
Yeah, Lucius demands that Tamora's eldest son, Alarbus, be sacrificed.
The specific phrasing in the text is incredibly chilling. He says it's to appease the spirits of his dead brother Zedmane's fratrum.
Right. He wants to literally hew Alarbus's limbs on a pile of wood right there in the streets of Rome.
And this demand precipitates the defining failure of empathy that dooms everyone.
Tamora is a queen, yes, but in this moment, she is simply a mother.
A mother who has lost her army, lost her freedom, and is now watching her firstborn son being dragged to a sacrificial fire.
She falls to her knees and makes this desperate, incredibly eloquent plea to Titus for mercy.
She begs him to recognize her grief as equal to his own, right?
Exactly. She says, oh, think my son to be as dear to me as thy sons are to thee.
She is trying to build a bridge of shared human experience.
Yeah. And then she delivers a line that really should be the moral anchor of the play. She says, sweet mercy is nobility's true badge.
Such a powerful line. She's practically begging Titus to rise above the barbarism of the battlefield.
To show the grace that a truly civilized, noble victor should possess.
But wait, I just can't buy Titus's logic here when he responds. He doesn't even weigh the moral weight of her argument.
No, he just coldly brushes her off.
He says, "Patient yourself, madam," and pardon me. And then he cites religious duty and Roman tradition, saying, religiously they ask a sacrifice.
And so, Alrebus is taken away, brutally dismembered, and thrown into a fire.
If you look at this from a modern organizational standpoint, it's terrifying.
Oh, completely.
It's exactly like a middle manager enforcing a zero-tolerance HR policy so rigidly that they absolutely destroy a human life.
Right, all while washing their hands of the guilt because, well, it's just company policy.
Or like someone clinging to the strict letter of a legal contract to bankrupt a former partner, completely ignoring the spirit of the agreement.
Yeah. At what point does following the rules become a psychological shield so we don't have to do the hard emotional work of being merciful?
That is the pivotal insight of this entire opening sequence. Titus is engaging in what Tamora perfectly describes as cruel, irreligious piety.
He believes he is honoring his dead sons, but he's completely blinding himself to the fact that he's inflicting the exact same trauma on another parent.
He uses protocol to avoid feeling.
The core wisdom here is that justice, when it is entirely untempered by mercy, is often just dressed up vengeance.
The moment you stop seeing the humanity in your opponent, you plant the seeds of your own destruction.
Titus thinks he is closing a chapter on a 10-year foreign war by checking off this religious box.
But in reality, by refusing to see Tamora's grief, he guarantees that the war will simply relocate inside the walls of Rome.
He traded a battlefield enemy for a domestic one, and he did it under the guise of being a good, rule-following citizen.
And because that seed of vengeance is planted in such a rigid, unfeeling way, it sprouts incredibly fast.
So fast. The violence sparked in the act escalates quickly and becomes so uniquely grotesque.
Right. It genuinely feels out of place when you compare it to the author's later, more refined works like Hamlet or Macbeth.
And this contrast actually forces us to take a step back and look at the historical and human context of the text itself.
Because for centuries, brilliant literary minds literally refused to believe Shakespeare wrote this play.
The authorship debate surrounding Titus Andronicus is one of the most fascinating controversies in literary history.
To understand why it's so debated, we have to look at the historical context through the eyes of two major critics from our sources.
Right. The English essayist William Hazlitt, writing in the early 19th century, and the German critic August Wilhelm Schlegel.
Hazlitt represents the traditional view of many later scholars who were just utterly repulsed by the text.
And Hazlitt does not pull his punches.
No, he doesn't. He argues the play is just an accumulation of vulgar physical horrors.
He claims the grammatical construction is false, the meter is halting and clunky.
He says it fundamentally lacks the psychological depth, the moral complexity, and the soaring poetry of Shakespeare's confirmed masterpieces.
He essentially looks at the pie baking and the dismemberments and says, this is a cheap, ugly slasher script.
The immortal bard of Avon couldn't possibly have written this trash.
Which is a completely understandable reaction if you are only familiar with the mature Shakespeare.
Right, but Schlegel offers a brilliant defense.
He does. He points to both hard external evidence and the reality of human development.
Historically, Schlegel points out that the play was included in the first folio.
Yes. For context, the first folio was the very first official collection of Shakespeare's plays, published in 1623.
By John Hemminch and Henry Condell. And these weren't just random publishers.
No, these were Shakespeare's fellow actors, his business partners, his friends who worked alongside him for decades.
Schlegel argues it is absurd to think his closest colleagues would commit a massive fraud by including a play he didn't write.
Furthermore, a writer named George Mears explicitly listed Titus Andronicus as one of Shakespeare's great tragedies in a book published in 1598.
While Shakespeare was still very much alive.
Exactly. So the historical record heavily favors Shakespeare's authorship.
So the receipts are there. But Schlegel's argument goes deeper than just historical ledgers, right?
It does. He uses this analogy about the founding of Rome that completely reframes how we should view the play.
He asks, was Rome any less the conqueror of the world just because, in its infancy, Remus could playfully leap over its first tiny mud walls?
It's an argument about the nature of artistic growth. Schlegel argues that while genius is, in a certain sense, infallible, art is to be learned.
We're watching a master serve his apprenticeship.
We have to remember the Elizabethan theatrical landscape of the early 1590s.
Shakespeare was a young writer, probably in his late 20s.
Yeah, trying to make a name for himself in a hyper-competitive commercial market. The public wanted shock value.
They were going to plays written by contemporaries like Christopher Marlowe and Thomas Kyd, whose Spanish tragedy was incredibly bloody and wildly popular.
So Shakespeare was a young man giving the market exactly what it demanded: violence, revenge, and spectacle.
If we think about the raw, unrefined nature of this text, it feels like a younger mind trying to process massive, overwhelming concepts.
Cosmic injustice and absolute grief.
Yeah, but he hasn't yet developed the subtle linguistic tools of his later career.
Schlegel actually connects the raw, screaming madness of Titus to the later, much more refined, poetic madness of King Lear.
It's like watching an artist test the waters of absolute despair with a sledgehammer before he learns how to use a scalpel.
That trajectory is vital to understand. In Titus, the horrors are entirely externalized severed hands, cut out tongues.
But by the time he writes Macbeth or Lear, the horror has moved inward. It's the psychological decay of the mind.
But he had to write the external horrors first to understand the landscape of human cruelty.
Okay, but if Hazlitt is right on some level, and this really is heavily reliant on vulgar horror, why should the modern listener care?
It's a fair question.
I mean, is analyzing Titus Andronicus just the intellectual equivalent of analyzing a terrible, low-budget 1980s horror movie?
The value lies precisely in witnessing that raw trajectory of growth.
How so?
Think of it like walking into a museum and looking at the awkward, early charcoal sketches of a master painter like Da Vinci or Michelangelo.
You don't study those early sketches because they are flawless masterpieces.
Right. You study them because they reveal how the artist learned to see the world.
They show the messy, imperfect process of a genius figuring out how to translate human suffering into art.
You don't get the Sistine Chapel without a few disproportionate, messy sketches first.
Knowing that this is an experimental, early text actually frees us. We don't have to expect perfect poetry.
Instead, we can dive back into the plot looking for those raw lightning strikes of brilliance.
Because even in its immature execution, this play captures a terrifyingly mature truth.
What happens to the human psyche when the societal institutions we rely on completely and utterly fail us?
And that failure is catastrophic. As we move into Acts 2 and the 3, we witness the complete rapid breakdown of the Roman social contract.
Tamora is almost immediately elevated to empress by the new, weak emperor Saturninus.
Now holding ultimate state power, she empowers her secret lover, Aaron the Moor, and her two brutal sons, Chiron and Demetrius.
Together they enact a staggering, multi-layered plot of revenge against the entire Andronicus family.
The pacing of the destruction is relentless.
First, Tamora's sons murder Bassianus, the emperor's own brother, during a hunt.
They throw his body into a concealed pit in the forest.
And then, through a forged letter planted by Aaron, they successfully frame Titus's two remaining sons for the assassination.
The state immediately condemns Titus's boys to death. But that's just the prelude.
Yeah, in the most infamous, brutal scene of the play, Tamora's sons hunt down Titus's daughter, Lavinia.
They drag her into the woods, they rape her, and then specifically to ensure she can never testify against them or write their names down.
They cut off her hands and cut out her tongue.
And they just leave her bleeding and wandering in the forest.
It is the ultimate physical manifestation of silencing a victim.
The state has literally stripped the Andronicus family of their ability to seek justice.
And the psychological torture is only beginning. While Titus's sons are awaiting execution for a murder they didn't commit, Aaron approaches Titus.
With this twisted bureaucratic bargain, Aaron claims to be an official messenger from the emperor.
He tells Titus that Saturninus will spare his sons' lives on one condition.
Titus, or one of his family members, must chop off their own hand and send it to the court as a token of absolute submission.
And Titus, a man who has already given 21 sons to Rome, who is desperate to save his last remaining boys, he actually agrees to it.
He has Aaron physically chop off his hand on the spot.
He gives a literal piece of his own flesh to the state to buy justice within the system.
And what is his reward for this ultimate sacrifice? A few moments later, a different messenger arrives, carrying a bag.
He dumps out Titus's severed hand, along with the severed heads of his two sons.
The system took his sacrifice, mocked it, and killed his children anyway.
This specific moment is where the worldview shatters for Titus.
He realizes with horrifying clarity that Rome is no longer a place of justice, law, or order.
Despite all its marble columns and Senate hearings, he describes it as a wilderness of tigers.
Tigers must pray, And Rome affords no prey but him and his family.
The Emperor Saturninus represents a corrupt, parasitic institution that actively feeds on its most loyal servants.
Titus gave 40 years of his life in military service. He gave his children's lives. He gave his own literal hand to Rome.
And Rome simply consumed him without a second thought.
The psychological horror of Aaron's trick with the hand is what makes this so deeply relevant today. It is institutional gaslighting at its most extreme.
Oh, absolutely.
You sacrifice a piece of yourself to appease a broken system, thinking if you just play by their brutal rules, they will eventually honor the contract.
But the system just laughs at you.
How do we translate this into 21st century realities? We are deeply conditioned from birth to trust the institutions of our lives.
Whether that's the legal system, a massive corporate employer, or even a trusted religious community.
How do we respond when the very structures meant to protect us become the tigers hunting us?
This is a crucial reflection for anyone navigating modern power dynamics. When an institution becomes a wilderness of tigers, continuing to play by its rules is suicidal.
Continuing to negotiate as if the institution is acting in good faith.
Exactly. The modern application is recognizing when a system is fundamentally broken.
If a corporate workplace demands that you sacrifice your mental health, your family time, your physical well-being, your metaphorical hand,
with the dangling promise of future security or promotion, and then consistently betrays you and lays you off the moment it's convenient.
you have to recognize the tiger. You cannot appease a corrupt system with self-mutilation.
The system will take your hand, and it will still take your livelihood.
You have to stop cutting off pieces of yourself for companies or toxic relationships or organizations that will only send those pieces back to you in a box.
That's a hard truth to accept.
It really is. But that realization brings us to a really difficult, practical crossroads.
When the system leaves you completely voiceless and mutilated like Lavinia, wandering the woods without a tongue or hands, how do you actually express the truth?
How do you expose the system when they've taken away your tools to do so?
The transition from enduring trauma to finding a response is perhaps the most poignant and strangely beautiful part of this incredibly dark play.
Yeah, in Act 4, we witness a heartbreaking scene. Lavinia, unable to speak, unable to write, is desperately chasing after her young nephew, Lucius.
The boy is terrified of her mutilated state and drops his school books as he runs.
Titus and his brother Marcus gently guide Lavinia to the books. She uses her stumps to frantically flip through the pages until she finds a specific story.
And she points to it.
She finds a copy of Ovid's Metamorphoses.
Yeah.
And she stops on the ancient Greek myth of Philomel.
For the listener who might not know the myth, Philomel was a princess who was raped by her brother-in-law, Teres.
To prevent her from telling anyone, Teres cut out her tongue.
But Philomel refused to be silenced. She used a loom to weave the story of her assault into a tapestry and sent it to her sister, exposing the crime.
Lavinia, trapped in a body that cannot speak, uses a piece of literature to communicate her own unspeakable reality.
This is a profound commentary by Shakespeare on the vital necessity of art and shared cultural narratives.
When direct speech is violently taken away, when the literal voice is silenced by oppression, abuse, or systemic marginalization, art becomes the vehicle for truth.
Lavinia finds her voice by pointing to a story that mirrors her own.
It's a powerful reminder that our pain, no matter how isolating, unique, or unutterable it feels in the moment, is part of a larger human tapestry.
Literature provides the vocabulary for trauma when the victim has none.
While Lavinia is fighting to communicate, we also have to look at Titus's reaction to this overwhelming cascade of grief.
Because his psychological journey here is fascinating.
Early in his despair, before he fully understands the corruption of Rome, he literally throws himself on the ground and talks to the paving stones of the street.
He says the stones are better listeners than the tribunes of Rome because at least the stones don't actively interrupt his pleading.
And they seem to weep with him when it rains.
But later, in that devastating moment when the messenger brings him his son's heads and his own severed hand, his brother Marcus tells him to grieve.
Marcus says, "Now is a time to storm. Why art thou still?"
And what does Titus do?
He laughs.
The stage direction and the script simply say, ha ha ha.
Marcus is completely appalled by this inappropriate reaction. He asks, "Why dost thou laugh? It fits not with this hour."
And Titus delivers one of the most chilling lines in all of literature. He says, "Why I have not another tear to shed."
I have not another tear to shed.
Wow.
The psychological weight of that line is immense.
Is Titus's laughter the moment his mind finally breaks and he goes insane?
Or is it the exact opposite? Is it the moment he becomes perfectly, terrifyingly sane to the reality of his world?
If we trace the trajectory of the play, that laugh is the absolute pivot point. It is not madness.
It is a terrifying, crystal clear sanity.
He realizes in that instant that crying to the heavens, pleading with corrupt men, and hoping for systemic justice within Rome is a complete delusion.
The laugh marks the death of his passive suffering.
He is no longer going to pour his emotional energy into the stones of a broken system.
The tears were for a world he thought had rules. The laughter is his entry into a world where he realizes there are no rules.
Which gives us a very sharp, practical reflection for the listener.
When you are facing a situation in your own life where you feel silenced, overwhelmed, or entirely disenfranchised by a system or a relationship, how are you directing your energy?
Are you, like early Titus, pouring your emotional labor into stones, pleading with bosses, toxic partners, or institutions that will never, ever care about your peers?
Or are you searching for the clarity that comes when you realize you have no more tears to shed for them and you must finally take agency for your own survival?
That realization is vital for self-preservation. Stop weeping to stones.
However, we must exercise extreme caution about what comes after the tears stop.
Because Titus's newfound clarity, his refusal to be a victim, leads directly into the play's infamously bloody climax.
And here we must confront the extreme danger of honor and exercise serious discernment.
Because the text goes to places that are deeply uncomfortable.
Uncomfortable is an understatement. Act V is the reason modern audiences recoil, and it's where Shakespeare tests the absolute limits of revenge.
Tamora, believing that Titus has completely lost his mind in grief, visits his house disguised as the mythological spirit of revenge.
She brings her two sons, Chiron and Demetrius, disguised as rape and murder.
She thinks she is brilliantly manipulating a madman, but Titus is completely lucid. He sees right through the theatrical disguise.
He plays along, convinces her to leave her sons behind with him, and the moment she leaves, the trap snaps shut.
He binds the two men who destroyed his daughter, and he calmly tells them exactly what he is going to do to them.
And the method of his revenge is entirely grotesque. He slits their throats while Lavinia catches their blood in a basin.
He then explains his culinary plan. He is going to grind their bones to dust, mix it with their blood, and bake their remains into a pie.
Just brutal. Later, he hosts a grand banquet, ostensibly to broker peace with the emperor and empress.
He serves this pie to Empress Tamora. He watches her eat it, and then, with horrifying satisfaction, reviews that she is consuming the flesh of her own children.
It is the ultimate mythological revenge. It's an echo of the ancient Greek myth of Atreus and Thyestes.
But before Tamora even has time to comprehend that she has committed cannibalism, Titus does something even more shocking.
Something that alienates almost every modern reader. He turns to Emperor Saturninus and asks a historical, philosophical question.
He asks if the ancient Roman centurion Virginius was right to slay his own daughter because she was enforced, stained, and deflowered.
The emperor, acting as the voice of Roman law, says yes because the girl should not survive her shame.
The moment the emperor validates this precedent, Titus turns and kills his own daughter Lavinia. He claims her death kills his sorrow.
This moment is the massive obstacle to growth for any modern audience.
The violence of the pie is grotesque enough, but the honor-killing of Lavinia is deeply offensive to our modern moral sensibilities.
The underlying Roman assumption here is that Lavinia's worth as a human being was entirely tied to her spotless chastity, and that her victimization brought a permanent shame upon the family that could only be erased by her death.
As modern readers seeking wisdom, we must completely, unequivocally reject that worldview.
We absolutely draw a hard boundary here. We have to use extreme discernment.
We can empathize with Titus's profound pain and his realization that the system is corrupt, without for a second endorsing his pie recipe.
And we certainly do not endorse his toxic, patriarchal views on purity and shame. We are not extracting a lesson that says, go get revenge like Titus.
The lesson is the exact opposite.
Precisely. The profound wisdom here operates as a negative example.
Shakespeare is showing us the logical, horrifying endpoint of an unchecked eye for an eye philosophy, especially when it is combined with rigid, toxic notions of honor.
The pursuit of perfect, absolute revenge does not restore justice. It does not undo the trauma inflicted on Lavinia.
It simply turns the victim into a monster who is indistinguishable from the oppressors.
By the time Titus serves that pie and kills his daughter, he has become just as savage, just as cruel, and just as destructive as the Goths he initially condemned in Act 1.
If we translate that to a modern everyday scale, it's like watching a friend who goes through a terrible breakup.
They become so obsessed with destroying their toxic, abusive ex that they slowly adopt all their ex's toxic behaviors.
They start stalking, hacking emails, spreading vicious rumors, manipulating mutual friends.
And suddenly you look at your friend and realize they have become the villain of their own story. The revenge consumes the host.
You set out on a righteous crusade to slay a monster, and you wake up to find you've grown fangs.
That is the exact psychological trap. When you define your entire existence solely by the wrong that was done to you, and your only remaining goal is retaliation, you surrender your humanity to the person who hurt you.
Titus thinks he is cleansing his family's honor and restoring balance to the universe, but he is merely plunging himself and everyone he loves into an absolute moral abyss.
So Titus represents the tragedy of relatively good men who is completely corrupted by his environment and his thirst for vengeance.
But we cannot finish this deep dive into Titus Andronicus without looking at the character who operates entirely outside the bounds of conventional morality from the very beginning.
We have to examine the anatomy of pure malice, which brings us to Timora's lover, Aaron the Moor.
He provides a stark, glaring contrast to the hypocritical honor of the Roman state.
Aaron is, without a doubt, one of the most fascinating and terrifying characters in early Shakespeare.
Near the end of the play, he is captured by the approaching Goth army led by Titus's exiled son.
And in a highly surprising twist for a character who has been pure evil, he fiercely protects his illegitimate infant child that he just had with Timora.
He bargains for the baby's life, showing this singular, fierce flash of paternal humanity.
But aside from protecting his child, he remains utterly, shockingly unapologetic for the litany of horrors he orchestrated throughout the play.
When they have him bound and are preparing to execute him, he doesn't plead for mercy like Timora did in Act 1.
He gives this final, defiant, breathtakingly dark speech.
He proudly lists all the murders, the rapes, the betrayals, and the mutilation that he caused.
And he ends it by saying, 10,000 worse than ever yet I did. Would I perform if I might have my will? If one good deed in all my life I did, I do repent it from my very soul.
It's almost hard to comprehend that level of darkness.
It is absolute, unadulterated nihilism.
Hazlitt, the critic who hated the rest of the play, actually argues that Aaron is the only thing in the entire text that shows true originality of conception.
Hazlitt notes that Aaron's perverse joy in his own wickedness and his pride in the blackness and ugliness of his child is the only psychological element worthy of Shakespeare's genius.
Aaron is a direct, undeniable precursor to Shakespeare's later legendary villains, like Iago in Othello or Richard III.
He is fascinating because he actively strips away all the societal pretenses.
The comparative insight here is staggering when you put Aaron next to the other characters.
The Romans and the Goths commit their atrocities, but they always do it under these lofty, noble guises.
Titus sacrifices a prisoner of war and claims it's for religious piety.
The Emperor Saturninus murders and executes people and calls it state justice.
Titus murders his own daughter and calls it honor. They all desperately need a moral justification to be cruel.
But Aaron commits atrocities simply because he wants to.
He explicitly states he wants his soul to be as black as his face. He is malicious for the pure, unadulterated joy of causing pain.
This dynamic connects deeply to broader human wisdom traditions regarding the nature of evil.
Many traditions across theology, philosophy, and modern psychology point out a very uncomfortable truth.
The most dangerous evil in the world isn't the chaotic, mustache-twirling villain who proudly declares himself a monster.
We know exactly what to do with a villain like Aaron. Society unites against him.
The truly dangerous, destructive evil is the systemic, self-righteous evil that hides behind the law, behind religion, behind tradition, exactly like the Roman state in this play.
It makes you wonder if Hazlitt was right to single him out. Is Aaron actually the most honest character in the play?
Because he's the only one not lying to himself about what he is?
If we use a modern analogy, Aaron is the ultimate internet troll.
He just wants to watch the world burn, and he admits it.
Meanwhile, the Romans are like the hypocritical moderators of a civilized forum, enforcing arbitrary rules, pretending to be noble, all while quietly stabbing each other in the back for power.
Aaron's refreshing, brutal honesty forces you to question all the civilized justifications we use for cruelty.
That analogy captures the dynamic perfectly. Aaron acts as a dark mirror held up to the Romans.
He essentially says, I am a monster by choice. I own my cruelty. What is your excuse?
He exposes the extreme fragility and the utter hypocrisy of their so-called civilization.
And that revelation brings us to the most crucial, lasting takeaway from this entire bloody, chaotic story.
We have navigated the sacrifices, the betrayals, the mutilations, the breakdown of justice, the horrific revenge pies, and the unrepentant villains.
When we step back from the wreckage of Titus Andronicus, what is the enduring wisdom? Where do we land?
I want to leave the listener with a final philosophical thought to mull over. Throughout this entire play, the Romans fiercely consider themselves the absolute pinnacle of human civilization, the arbiters of law, order, and piety.
They view the Goths and outsiders like Aaron as entirely barbarous.
Yet as the narrative unfolds, Shakespeare reveals that the civilized Romans, with all their rules and traditions, are capable of far greater atrocities and far more systemic cruelty than the barbarians they conquered.
The play forces us to look in the mirror today.
What civilized structures in our own modern lives, in our corporate workplaces, our political systems, our legal frameworks, or our social norms are actually masking barbarity?
Where are we using words like protocol, policy, or honor to justify crushing other human beings?
Exactly.
That's the heart of this section. This is Wisdom for the Present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.